right, so the second big skill that we discussed in class is this general idea of being a more critical consumer of the information that you encounter on the web or in the news or in magazines. So I have this one finding here that I saw published not just in the Chicago Tribune, but in many other places as well, this idea that using social networks, particularly like Facebook, is associated with depression. So what I'd like for you to do now, one of your tasks, is to just pause the video and reflect on what do you think. Do you think that social networks cause depression? I want you to not just answer that question, but also to elaborate. Why? You think yes, why? You think no, why? And if you prefer to just think, well, it depends, then I want you to think about what does it depend upon? What might make the difference between why some people in some circumstances get depressed and others in other circumstances don't? Give that some thought and then go ahead and advance. I really hope that you did actually do that and that you didn't just go ahead and advance in the video, but obviously that's up to you. In class, the students brainstormed a number of reasons why it might be yes, why it might be no, and a number of variables that spoke to this issue of it depends. And I have a graph right here. What I see in this graph is that the answer is it depends. So for some people, social networks are problematic, and for some it's not. So we're looking at two variables here. What is the quality of the person's friendships offline? And then also how much are they actually using the social network? What we see is if you have really good high quality friendships, you're sitting with people at lunchtime, you have lots of great talks with people, you have friends that you can count on, it really doesn't matter how often you're using Facebook. However, if you're down around the people who have low quality friendships, the folks who maybe feel disconnected from others, who don't have buddies in the lunchroom, for example, well, in that case, if you have low quality friendships, then if you are using the social networks a lot, then it's going to be causing you depression, probably because you're looking at other people, you're comparing your lives to their sort of fake lives that are on Facebook. If you have low quality friendships, you're probably more likely to be bullied on Facebook. So here, again, it depends. It depends upon what is your friendship quality, and it also depends on how much you are using social networks like Facebook. Now, if you were somebody who thought, well, I don't know, I think maybe actually using social networks could be beneficial. Well, in that case, there's some data to support your idea as well. Now, this is older research, so they studied instant messaging, but for more modern times, we could say that this is probably like a personalized message you might send on Facebook. Now, not surprisingly, again, we see if you have high quality friendships, it really doesn't matter how much you're messaging people. But if you are somebody who's feeling outcast at your own school, in your own particular geographical area, well, in that case, being able to message people, perhaps other folks who are feeling like they're a little bit of a misfit, well then, if you can private message, then you're actually less likely to be depressed, if you're doing it a lot, than folks who are also staying away from the private messaging. So this graph tells us that for those folks who have low quality friendships, using social networks can actually be beneficial. So when you see data like this right here, definitely read the article. Maybe if you're curious, look up some additional reliable research articles. If you're really curious, see if you can find the original article, which is where I got those graphs, but reflect upon, does this claim make sense to me? Or do I think there might be some other intervening variables? So I could say, do social networks cause depression? Well, it depends. And it probably depends on a lot more than just friendship quality and how much you use it. I think the class came up with probably about 20 different variables. And I think probably most of those variables were right on the money. All right, moving on. The next skill that we discussed is identifying research reports that are science and comparing those to research reports that are really just pseudoscience and not very reliable. So of course the goal of science is to not just explain a phenomenon, but also try to make predictions and control it. So let's say you wanted to do a study on improving hand washing in the hospital. Well, probably one of the first things you want to do is to explain why folks aren't washing their hands, and you could do that in a variety of ways, but that would be part of a scientific study, would be to explain it and describe what's going on. And then you might also want to come up with a particular ad campaign or a training workshop and make certain predictions about whether or not you think that campaign or workshop is going to actually have a controlling effect on hand washing. So doing an actual study that not just explains the phenomenon but makes certain predictions and works to control behavior, this is psychology, so we're studying behavior, that would be science. Now, there's also pseudoscience, which in many ways can look like the same thing, and I'll show you an example here in just a moment. One thing is pseudoscience often does not have or never has peer review. The scholarly articles will typically list the fact that this research was reviewed by peers of the authors. So that would be other people with expert credentials who are already in the area, in that research area, who have given it their stamp of approval. Yes, this is a good study, this is good science, their conclusions are sound, the statistics they did are sound. That's peer review. That's what you want to look for. Not only does pseudoscience not have that, but it also tends to rely a lot on personal experience and anecdotes. There are claims a lot on late night TV, people trying to sell products, where they really emphasize the anecdote, especially celebrity anecdotes. I'm going to skip that spurious correlation. Typically, pseudoscience does not use any kind of rigorous test. It doesn't use your classic double-blind experiment like so much of health science does. Sometimes it involves the supernatural, special magical particles that are affecting us. Often pseudoscience will involve ancient wisdom. So, for example, there might be a claim about the phenomenon of acupuncture, but instead of actually doing a scientific study of it, the person that's talking about it simply says, well, you know, the Chinese have been doing it for 5,000 years, and so isn't that good enough for you? And often the pseudoscientist will mock mainstream science. So they might say, well, yeah, you might want to use morphine if you just want to use plain old-fashioned money-grubbing Western science. But if you want a really good result, then you can use the ancient wisdom of 5,000 years of Chinese people and use acupuncture. So in that sentence, basically, I was mocking mainstream or Western science. I skipped over spurious correlations. A spurious correlation is something that it looks like there's an association. So maybe every time I wear my, when I was a student, I had a special outfit that I wore whenever I gave a presentation. And whenever I wore that particular outfit, I got an A on my presentation. And so that's a spurious correlation. Those two things are associated, but it really doesn't mean that the outfit had anything to do with my getting a good grade. Or it might be if you rub a particular ointment on your skin, a day later your cold goes away. Okay, so there's an association there, the ointment and your cold going away, but that doesn't mean that the ointment actually did anything to make the cold go away. Probably it was just time. And quite often pseudoscience relies on these correlations that don't actually mean anything. So what I want to do now is to have you take a look at a research report, and I want you to read over it, and I want you to think about what are some strengths of this research report, and also what are some weaknesses. Think about the research that's done and also the way that it was reported. And as you're doing that, see if you can find some evidence of pseudoscience. All right, this research report, I sent that to you in an email. A while back, I Googled the terms autism and vaccines, and it was the very first thing that came up. So I'm sure many folks read this. This is the actual report in its original source. I've sent to you just the print-friendly version. Again, read over it, look for strengths, and look for weaknesses. All right, if you haven't yet looked for strengths and weaknesses, do that now. Pause the video, do that now. And once you have a couple of your own ideas, I think I'll probably come up with about 10, then come back and I'll talk about it with you. All right, one thing we want to look for is, does this seem like a reliable article? The author right here, we don't know anything about her. We know she's a Yahoo contributor. She doesn't have any kind of credentials. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can see there are no scientific references. So right away, this is telling me that this is not a reliable article. However, it does look like science. It has some statistics. It talks about a research study But when we actually look more closely, the research study isn't very well done, and the statistics are not very compelling. So I'm really looking at this as an example of a bad research report of pseudoscience. One problem that I'm seeing in her reporting is that there is definitely some bias in her language. So she's not taking the CDC at its word. That seems a little bit biased. Another thing is, we look right down here, again, there's some mockery of mainstream science, CDC, kind of mocking the CDC right there. There's also a reliance on personal experience. So rather than citing a scientist, she cites a friend of hers right here. When we actually look at the research study that was done, this was just a phone survey, which has its own problems. How do you know the people on the other end are telling you the truth? How do you know they really understand what autism is? So that's questionable. Another problem is the phone survey was done only in 9 counties, so that means there's a fairly small sample size. Autism affects 1 in every 120 people, so we really want a pretty large sample size in order to get a nice number of folks who have autism included. Another problem is they only did their study in Oregon and Northern California. And you might imagine that the folks who are living in this area are not necessarily representative of the more general population. So that's a problem. It's not a representative sample of the United States. So there's some definite problems with the way that they did the study. Another thing that we see is when we look at the data, where's that data? Right here. The data is rather surprising. I mean, first of all, they're seeing this huge effect in boys and then no effect in girls. And that doesn't make sense, and she doesn't talk about why that might be. However, when we look at the younger kids, the rate went as high as 224% more likely to have attention deficit. All right, that is a pretty compelling statistic, but it's so huge that it makes me skeptical. And in fact, we could get this number right here, or this 300% number, if they found maybe one person who had autism who was not vaccinated, and then 3 people who had autism who were vaccinated. So there's 3 times as many who were vaccinated as there were autistics who were not vaccinated. So that's an increase in 300%. But the difference between 3 in one group and 1 in the other really isn't all that compelling. Is that worth you not vaccinating your child and increasing the entire community's risk for whooping cough and diphtheria and measles, mumps? It isn't for me. I would want to see much bigger numbers from a much larger sample. So just because there's statistics does not mean that this is a reliable article. The final critique that I have is down here. If you want to blame vaccinations, a simple causation is there. She says that in 1983, average child received 10 vaccinations. 2007, we received many more vaccinations. And her argument is that as number of vaccinations has gone up, number of autism cases has gone up. And indeed, there's a correlation right there. That's a spurious correlation. But does it mean that the increase in vaccines caused the increase in autism? No, probably not. Think about all the other things that have changed since 1983. The internet, for example. So should we say that the internet has caused autism? We could also say that Go-Gurt, the food product Go-Gurt consumption has gone up since 1983. So should we say that Go-Gurt consumption has caused autism? No, of course not. There are many things that have changed over the last 30 years, but we really can't just say, well, because this has changed and this has changed, that thing caused this thing. No, not at all. Oh, one final thing is that she claims that this was all from a reporter's idea. Now, she says that the CDC never did a research study. And I'm thinking, if a reporter can come up with this research idea, well then, by golly, I am pretty sure somebody in a research lab who could stand to get millions of dollars for doing this study would have done it. And lo and behold, that is indeed the case. So when I read claims like that, and it's something that I'm interested in, I do my due diligence, and I will often go to Google Scholar and look it up, just like I did here. And when we see the results, no evidence for a causal association in The Lancet. That's a very reliable journal. No evidence in the Lancet. This one is the British Medical Journal. If I actually looked at this, we would see there's no evidence for a relationship. And in each of these studies, they're looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So when you read a claim that seems a little sketchy, maybe, go ahead and just look for either a reliable website or, even better, a scholarly website. All right, now the final task that we did in the class was to work on this worksheet that I emailed to you, evaluating claims. There are 5 different claims that are listed here, and for each one I want you to read over it and see if you can come up with 1 or 2 reasons why the conclusion is problematic. Or think about, is there another way of interpreting the claim, or maybe could there be other information that you would like to have? Would there have been a better way to do the study? All right, so this is really just getting you warmed up for things we'll talk about next week. And this is something that I would like for you to submit to me on or before class time next week. This is basically just going to go towards class participation. So if you give it a good shot, you have your class participation, no problem. If you skip it, then you don't. But even more so, more important than the grade, really is the mental effort that you're putting into giving it some thought. If you want to talk to people who had been in the class and get some of the ideas that we discussed in class, that's fine. But I do want you to give some thought to all 5 of these and just jot down a few ideas. You can either type it out and email it, or you can write it and hand it to me. And I'd like to see that you have given each of these some thought. All right, that does it for this alternative lecture. I look forward to receiving the emailing or evaluating claims worksheet, and please contact me as questions come up.